These days, the parking lot at 66 Mario Lemieux Place is unassuming, serving the Paints Arena, the home of Pittsburgh's National Hockey League franchise, the Penguins. However, this location once housed an arena topped with a titanic stainless steel dome, one whose resemblance to an igloo was the namesake for its hockey team. From their controversies surrounding its construction to the myriad of events it held, it still has the distinction of being the world's first major sports venue with a retractable roof, even after its demolition. So what remains of its legacy? Join me to find out as today we discover the rise and fall of Pittsburgh's lost Civic Arena. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. The first mentions of a civic center date as far back as 1909, when one Charles Mulford Robinson describes proposals for a civic center and an educational and cultural center. Robinson, an urban planning theorist, proposed a civic center plan that would draw more traffic towards the business district of Pittsburgh. This plan eventually faded away, but its spirit lived on, primarily due to the location brought up. Robinson is quoted in saying, "It would substitute for a mean and shabby portion of the city, an ensemble, beautiful and effective." He was referring to the poor tenement section, or more specifically, the Lower Hill District, the cultural center of African American life within the city. Today, when looking at maps of the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, one will see a large, triangular shape poking out of the central business district. That shape is what eventually became the Civic Arena after a massive swath was claimed in eminent domain from the neighborhood of Crawford Roberts, one of the neighborhoods making up the Hill District. The Hill was a nationwide hub of music, and one of the main places where jazz took hold. It sported a large catalog of night spots, including nightclubs and bars that thrived on the musical talent that flooded in and out of the community, making it a regular stop for hit jazz musicians such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington on tours. And it remained a capital of music and art for nearly 40 years, being dubbed the crossroads of the world by Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay. However, redevelopers didn't see any of that social vibrancy. All they saw were the hard times the neighborhood fell into during the mid-1950s. Then a case was made after a single-paged document surfaced depicting the degradation of the neighborhood. However, many recall it used questionable criteria for what was considered substandard to begin with. For example, featuring photos from back alleys to accuse the main streets of dilapidation. Now, there had been legitimate sanitary concerns, but the residents had always petitioned for improvement rather than destruction. Regardless of the reality of the situation, plans for redevelopment pressed on, and the 1953 Lower Hill Redevelopment Plan emerged from the Pittsburgh Housing Authority, with the centerpiece of it all being the Civic Arena, an icon of the technological progress of the space age. This arena resembled a flying saucer. The proposal featured commercial and residential buildings surrounding the arena in neat parallel lines. Upon being presented, the plans re-emphasized the quoted blight, decay, and worn-out structures. And then these notions were coupled with many self-congratulatory quotes, which were distributed in brochures. And like wildfire, the idea caught on. The Civic Arena itself was designed by one Edgar J. Kaufman, the owner of a department store chain. At the time, he was president of the Pittsburgh Civic Light Opera, and he was looking for a new location for his opera company to call home. After gaining support from then-Mayor David L. Lawrence, his plan became the centerpiece of the Lower Hill redevelopment project. As the Pittsburgh Housing Authority approved the plans, provisions were written for the people it was about to displace. The media focused on the good news, mentioning the job openings in construction, but for some, this news wasn't comforting because they were still dealing with the reality of losing their homes. As demolition began, images of displaced families living in their new lodgings were printed in newspapers, and while this was spun from a positive angle, the reality was less pleasant. You see, in the wake of the Civic Arena zoning, 1,885 families were displaced from the Lower Hill neighborhood. And here's the catch. Alongside the new Civic Arena, only 595 apartments were constructed, and they all charged high rent, meaning that most of the Lower Hill residents were forced to move to even more dilapidated areas than what was just demolished. And had the plans continued, they would have likely had to move from those areas just a few more years later. Now, as the Civic Arena was constructed, many jobs went to African Americans. However, this was not enough to change the dramatically shifting public opinion. As a solution, the redevelopers published more brochures about the Civic Arena and their progress, and those images were printed in newspapers and national periodicals, but even so, dissent began to grow. The Pittsburgh Courier, an African-American newspaper that had previously supported the plans, withdrew support after seeing how the Lower Hill redevelopment plan had betrayed their people. This eventually culminated in a large anti-redevelopment movement, which only grew after the Civic Arena opened in September of 1961. With its opening, most newspapers and periodicals hailed it as another mark of the March of Progress, but it didn't take long for this narrative to turn against them. That same year, the Courier shot back, declaring, quote, "They saw the grim specter of old Jim Crow hovering over the stainless steel monument. Worse yet, for the arena's optics, the employment deal during construction did not extend to after it opened, as all the arena employees were white, meaning the location's original residents were out of luck. The reaction was fast and harsh, with many protests arising almost immediately after it opened, opposing the perceived unfair hiring practices and further redevelopment. The height of this was in 1968, when just across the street from the Civic Arena, a sign went up addressing City Hall, saying, quote, "No redevelopment beyond this point." That same year, further redevelopment plans were canceled, and the arrival of the Civic Arena signaled a decline for the grassroots culture that the city has never really recovered from. As previously mentioned, the design of the Civic Arena came from Edgar J. Kaufman, which can be a bit confusing as his design was for an opera company, but as we know now, the stadium was used for hockey. You see, the initial plan was to create an arena for theater that exemplified the cutting edge of architecture and arts of all kinds. The project totaled $22 million at the time, or $253 million in 2023. Despite the eminent domain displacement and the steel strike in 1959 that delayed the opening date, the Civic Arena opened in September of 1961 to critical acclaim. The dome that made it so iconic was supported by a 260-foot-long cantilever arm, keeping it free from supports so that the views of the spectacular sky would be clear of any obstruction. The dome was made of 8 stainless steel wedges, 6 of which could slide underneath the other 2 mounted pieces, unveiling the sky above in 2.5 minutes. The first stadium with a retractable roof was unveiled during a Carol Burnett show on July the 4th, 1962, where she presented it by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present the sky." However, closing the top was a much more difficult task. Closure required 42 trucks mounted to 78 wheels to move the 6 wedges back into position and cover the dome. Well, this was extremely innovative for the time. Modern domes use much more efficient methods that require less time and money. Initially, the stadium's capacity was a little less than 11,000, but as time went on, expansions brought that number up to 17,537 by the 1990s. Its initial opening saw the Civic Arena hailed as one of the best in the country, which remained true for decades to come. In fact, in 1976, Billboard ranked the stadium at 9th in the entire nation. While it was outfitted for concerts and opera, its size meant that it had the facilities to accommodate a major sports team. It even had a cutting-edge scoreboard, which would come to be enjoyed by the National Hockey League. You see, Pittsburgh's American Hockey League team, then known as the Hornets, had been active since 1936 and were drawn to the arena since its opening. As Pittsburgh had loved the sport already, and it just so happened to have one of the best arenas in the world, the National Hockey League set Pittsburgh as one of 6 cities for its 1967 expansion. With its inauguration into the National Hockey League, Pittsburgh required a new team. In an effort led by Pennsylvania State Senator Jack McGregor, a new franchise was founded for the city, and a naming contest began. Most would agree that due to the arena's nickname, the Igloo, in reference to its shape and color, the name the Penguins was decided on. The Igloo of Penguins also featured the city's Golden Triangle, the name for its downtown business district. However, the Civic Arena was not to last, as the dome that had made it so iconic was becoming too much of a liability, with full retractions being stopped after 1995 and remaining permanently closed from 2001. The building itself fully closed on June the 26th, 2010. It was denied historic status by any authority, with demolition starting in 2011 and finishing in 2012. Once again, the topic for redevelopment cropped up, but a parking lot for the new PPG Paints Arena went up instead, with 2 streets demolished for the construction of the arena being reinstated. The Igloo was never just a hockey venue, despite that being its main claim to fame. It was a scene for many other events. It became quite well known for its rock concerts, the first of which happened on May the 11th, 1962, emceed by Pittsburgh radio announcer Porky Chedwick, featuring talents like Jackie Wilson, the Drifters, the Coasters, the Castells, Jerry Butler, the Flamingos, the Angels, the Bluebells, and the Skyliners. Its next noteworthy event was a concert on September the 14th, 1964, featuring the sensational English band, the Beatles, on their first tour of the United States. The arena sold out with a crowd of 12,000 in attendance. As time passed, more musicians performed in the Civic Arena. On May the 2nd, 1970, the Doors played and recorded their live performance, widely regarded to be their best live recording. Black Sabbath played on February the 1st, 1974, breaking their box office record by grossing $76,000, or $474,300 in 2023. That same year, in August, the Canadian rock band Rush debuted Neil Peart, an eventually award-winning talent. Elvis Presley also performed on December the 31st, 1976, in what became his final New Year's Eve show. There were also several artists who performed several times. The Rolling Stones performed 3 times in total: July the 22nd, 1972, March the 11th, 1999, and July the 10th, 2003. Michael Jackson also performed 3 times at the Civic Arena, but these were back-to-back events on September the 26th, 7th, and 8th of 1988 as a part of his Bad World Tour. The Grateful Dead also performed a concert in April of 1989, an event that became national news following a riot breakout after the fact, in which over 500 were arrested, and the Pittsburgh police drew nationwide scrutiny for their use of force. But the final event at the Civic Arena was a musical performance when James Taylor and Carole King arrived in Pittsburgh for their reunion tour. Music and hockey were not the only kind of events happening in the arena. Basketball has had a history in the Pittsburgh Igloo, starting with America's first high school basketball all-star game. The Roundball Classic had its home annually in the Civic Arena from 1965 to 1992, as well as hosting the city's NCAA Division I institutions, the University of Pittsburgh and Duquesne University, which both used it as either a primary or secondary home court. It was also a satellite venue for the Philadelphia 76ers between 1964 and 1973. Beyond that, the Civic Arena also held several boxing matches. For example, from the Igloo, the world watched on TV as Muhammad Ali knocked out Charlie Powell on January the 24th, 1963. Another globally televised event was the World Heavyweight title match on November the 6th, 1981, between Holmes and Snipes. The venue also served as a recording location for several films. One of the most notable examples of this is the 1995 action film Sudden Death, which had its final act take place in the arena, and notably, Jean-Claude Van Damme's character opens the retractable roof. There were also several professional wrestling matches held in the Civic Arena. The WWF SummerSlam 1995 and Unforgiven 2001 pay-per-view event occurred here, as well as the WWE No Way Out 2005 event, the Armageddon in 2007, and Bragging Rights in 2009. However, most notable was the WWF King of the Ring 1998, where the legendary Hell in a Cell match of Mankind vs. The Undertaker took place, in what turned out to be one of the most iconic matches of all time. The iconic match was defined by Mankind, played by Mick Foley, falling from the top of the cell, causing multiple injuries and cementing its place in WWE history. During their final regular game season, the Pittsburgh Penguins gathered over 50 of their former members for a team picture as a farewell to their longtime team home. The Igloo's demolition occurred at a time when it was both the oldest and third smallest arena in the National Hockey League, and the PPG Paints Arena across the street was a direct upgrade. The steel from the dome of the building was crafted into over 40,000 Christmas ornaments sold by the Penguins for its charitable foundation. From its controversial beginnings, the Civic Arena struggled to claim a positive image, being the first and only part of a plan that destroyed a culturally significant neighborhood, and after decades of being a wedge between the Hill District and Pittsburgh's downtown, it seems to have largely broken free of its challenging reputation. While some still revile it and the story of its creation, others looked past that and more at what it became later. The world's first major sports arena with a retractable roof, which set a precedent for the many stadiums that followed in its footsteps. But today, it is a parking lot for the successor across the street. You might even say that the Igloo melted, leaving its mark on the map of Pittsburgh that can only be seen with a trained eye. And thank you all for watching. Until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.